I remember one of my childhood friends who had come to visit me, and she was telling me how, the doctors were asking her, how did I seem to them? And she told them that I seemed normal. I didn't have anyone to advocate for me. I was living in Philadelphia. I had no family in the state of Pennsylvania, so it was just me and my 7-year-old. And my older son, who was 17, he would come over because he was able to drive, and he came over and he helped me out a lot when I was released from the hospital. And I remember being home, and I had so many thoughts racing through my head, but it was like my mouth couldn't keep up with my thoughts. And I mean, it was so much that I wanted to say. I would actually get dizzy just with all the thoughts, in my head, but, getting them out my mouth, it just, I don't know, it just took a while, but eventually, I pulled it all together and I got through my recovery and I was able to go back to work in 6 months as an official court reporter. And that job is very stressful. And I remember in the letter when my doctor released me back to work, he said, her memory is not blunted by any stretch of the imagination. And that was probably because when I went for my post-op visit, I walked in the room and I told the doctor, I said, I have a million questions. And he said, shoot. And that I did. And so I remembered everything, that happened. And I'm glad I did because, like I said, I didn't have anyone, to advocate for me. And even for me to have surgery because my children were minors, they had to call my aunt who was living in New Jersey and, get her to, you know, to give them permission to do the surgery, which obviously she did. She was almost in her 80s and she would take New Jersey Transit to come over to Philadelphia, to visit me, and that that meant a lot to me for her to, to take New Jersey, to take public transportation to come over to Philadelphia because, coming from, the suburbs into the big city, but she loved me and she did it. So, I went back to work. I was on light duty, at first. And so I I was doing okay. And then maybe about a year, a year and a half later, like gradually I started feeling down because obviously after the surgery and I survived, I was feeling euphoric and, just especially knowing what my odds were and the fact that I survived and I had no neurological deficits and I was able to go back to work. And I also didn't know, how serious, aneurysms were until I went to support group meetings and, I saw that the people there didn't fare as well as I did. And I kind of felt out of place, I guess. But I still, would try to be, supportive to others and stay positive. And so, as I was saying, like maybe a year and a half, I started feeling down. I mean, it was even obvious to other people when I would go to work, they would say, are you okay? Because it just I just like I had no energy. I didn't want to eat. I just I can't explain the feeling. So, I went to the doctor and they sent me, to, get counseling. And that was a process, by itself, because you'll go to a counselor and that counselor may not be the right fit for you. And, you may have to go through a couple before you find someone that you really feel comfortable, talking to. And also there was, I had to be medicated. And that's another thing, you have to try these different medications until you find the right one that works for you. And I did that. I did the counseling. I took the medication. It was a long process. I went to church. I prayed. My family, my church family, my family, everybody, was, supporting me, as best they could. And, it was like I really had to fight to get through that. I think that was actually worse than the aneurysm, because I had to want to feel better. I had to do things to make myself feel better while I still went to work, because I had two children, who were depending on me. And so that may have been a year, maybe, maybe more so. I mean, it was so bad, it was to the point that I thought I didn't want to be here anymore. And I know some people, when they hear that, they think, that's, such a selfish um, feeling or way to think. But like the doctor said, anytime the brain is touched, it can cause a chemical imbalance. So it was kind of out of my control how I was feeling. I had two kids, but when that depression, took over, I was in a whole nother place. But I hung in there. I kept going to counseling. I took my medication. I prayed. I tried to stay active. I forced myself to do things that I really didn't feel like doing. And I even had someone say, "Oh, just snap out of it." You don't just snap out of depression. You don't. But eventually I felt better. I felt myself. And so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. I eventually, after my son graduated, my younger son, after he graduated from high school, I applied for a job at Circuit Court for Prince George's County in Maryland, where I live now. And so I took that position. And while I was there, it wasn't right away, but I had been assigned by my supervisor to take a medical malpractice case where a woman had TBI, traumatic brain injury. And I was thinking, am I going to be able to do this without getting emotional? So I go into the courtroom, the case goes on. And then during a break, one of the attorneys came up to me and he said, "You didn't seem fazed by any of the terminology." Because sometimes you can only imagine, the terms, the medical terms, technical terms that we may hear that we may not have ever heard before. And, as a court reporter, we can, ask them, to repeat it, to spell things, or, we do have access to the exhibits. But this attorney noticed that I didn't seem fazed. And so I said to him, I said, "I don't say this to a lot of people." I said, "But I'm a brain aneurysm survivor." Actually, I'm a two-time brain aneurysm survivor. I had a second one. That one they caught because they had watched me for several years, and um, they clipped that one. But I told the attorney, I said, "I'm a two-time brain aneurysm survivor. I'm familiar with the terminology." And I think he may have been, maybe a little nervous, thinking, is she really getting this? I was, because I was familiar with the terminology. Who would have thought, after what I had gone through, having, a ruptured brain aneurysm, that I would be in the courtroom taking a case where a woman had a traumatic brain injury.